Hello and welcome to another episode of Coffee at Wynns. We're here in the beautiful surrounds of Wynns Hotel in Dublin city centre. My guest today is Mark Henry, the author of this important book, in fact, An Optimist's Guide to Ireland at 100. And it's a book that marks 100 years of the Irish state. The Irish state came into being on the 6th of December 1922, 1 year to the day after the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. Mark, you're very welcome to Coffee at Wynns.
Thank you very much.
Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all. This is your first book.
Yeah, well, exactly. I studied psychology years ago. There's a bit of psychology in this. We'll come back to that later. But I've been working in tourism the last 20 years, actually. So I've been out there telling the world what a great place Ireland is. And I said, you know what? It's time to tell the Irish. Because objectively, when you look at it, we have an incredible story to tell. It's not been a perfect century, but we've lots to boast and to celebrate and to crack out the champagne for on the 6th of December.
So tell us, what made you write this book?
I think, you know, that first century, if you think about it, was all about our independence from the UK, trying to break away from the UK, particularly those early decades, right? And, you know, this is a lot more about what we've achieved in recent decades. And when you look at that, we've moved past the UK in so many ways. I mean, I talk about all sorts of areas, from economic development to social development to freedom of media to, you know, corruption and so on, lack of. Point is, on a lot of these metrics, Ireland is now well exceeding the UK, and also indeed, if you look to the US as well, the same is true. So the normal tradition in Ireland, I suppose, to look east and look west and see what's happening in these places, these other English-speaking countries, and to compare ourselves to them. I think a big bit of what I'm arguing here is actually we need to look north. It's the Scandinavian countries, which is the top of the tables, that are up there with Ireland at the moment. We're now approaching Norway's, the Finlands, the Icelands, the Swedens of this world, Denmark, on so many of these measures of quality of life, these measures of progress for the country. And I think that's where we can learn a lot from as we go into our second century.
Now, you spoke about the metrics that you're talking about, and there's a lot of them in this book. Just tell us some of the indexes that Ireland, where Ireland is near the top in terms of quality of life and GDP, etc.
Well, there's a lot in there. So for the 100 years, I gathered 100 data points that span everything, you know, education, economics, you name it, social, cultural, to look at how we've moved on, how we've developed, and as you say, put them in a global context occasionally. So, I mean, so for example, and one I cite a lot is that the United Nations, just before COVID, they produced their annual report, as they have, tracking quality of life, human development. And they've been doing this since 1990. 1990, when they first started, Ireland was 23rd in the world rankings. Now, or at least in 2019, we were second only to Norway in terms of quality of life. I mean, that's an incredible. No other developed nation has seen as much development over those 30 years. Now, what are they looking at? Well, they're looking at, are people living long and healthy lives? Come back to that one. Are people well educated, able to fulfill their human potential? Are people economically well? Do they have a high standard of living physically? And on all of these criteria, Ireland has seen remarkable improvements in all of these criteria. We are amongst the best in the world. In fact, as I prove in the book, the data is there. So it's unsurprising, actually, when you step back to say, no matter how you look at it, Ireland is amongst the most developed places. We are actually living in one of the best countries to live in on planet Earth, factually, objectively.
Yes, and you do say the title of your book is, in fact, An Optimist's Guide to Ireland at 100. So you're not giving your opinion here. You're stating, look at the data evidence. So tell us a few things that might surprise people about where Ireland's at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's pick at each of those three areas that the United Nations turn to. So are people living long and healthy lives in Ireland? Well, in fact, on average, the Irish person today lives 82 years. Women a little bit longer, men a little bit less. But that's only 2 years less than the world's longest livers, the Japanese. So we're just 2 years short. We now live a year longer on average than the average Brit does. We live a couple of years longer, several years longer, in fact, than the average American these days, due to, unfortunately, negative impact of COVID and their opiate epidemic. So again, when EU surveys, again, talk about the self-reported health in the book, 84% of Irish people describe their health as good or very good, higher than any other country in Europe. So are we living long and healthy lives? Objectively so. In fact, compared to our ancestors' 1920s, we've added 25 years to our lifespan, a whole generation extra.
And yet, you will hear people say that we have a terrible health service in this country. Your data would seem to suggest otherwise.
The objective outcomes, if you like, out the other end are that we are living healthier. Again, talk about the top 20 killers of Irish people back in 1920s. We've eliminated most of them, or vastly reduced the others. Even the one that isn't, which is cancer. More people dying of that today than 1920s, partly because we're living longer. So therefore there are more older people, therefore there are more people who get cancer. But even there, the cancer fatality rate peaked about 20 years ago. Since then, we're seeing significant declines, i.e. improvements in health even of that disease. So we're overcoming those battles, and the evidence is that we're doing so better than nearly any other place. So I mean, the number of treatments in hospitals I talk about, it's doubled in 20 years.
Let's talk about this graph in the book. It's extraordinary. Cancer is a huge killer, we all know that. And yet look at the survival rate from cancer as in your book. What's that down to?
Yeah, people might say that some of this isn't unique to Ireland. This is true.
Yes.
Globally, we're winning the battle against cancer. But again, for each of these trends in the book, I spoke to experts in the area and said, what's happening? Again, sometimes we complain about we're losing local health services. But the head of the National Cancer Registry, who I spoke to, said, no, part of the success in winning this battle against cancer is the fact we have centralised services, so that we have experts. So instead of being operated perhaps in a local facility on someone who might do a breast cancer operation or a colon cancer operation once a week, now you've got people who are doing it every day. So they're far more skilled, so it has improved your chances of survival, for example. Likewise, of course, a lot of the health programs have been put in place, whether it's breast check or other things like this, have meant that people have spotted those cancers earlier. So again, they're being treated earlier. We've taken steps as a country to consistently and persistently improve the quality of health services, improve the quality of services in general provided to citizens. Again, talk about the fact that, go back to 1970, the government was spending, in today's money, €350 per man, woman and child on health services, on public health services. Today it's 3,500 per man, woman and child, and there's 2 more million people living here than there was back then. So we're investing a lot, and we are seeing the benefits from that. Now, could it be better? Sure, there are new treatments being identified all the time. We are all aging, so we're catching more things. We're living longer, so we're going to get more diseases.
And there's a trolley count. I mean, we have to be honest about that. That's an issue every year. But it seems to me that that's an administration issue. But the access to healthcare in this country is very good. And as you say, that is borne out by the fact that we have one of the longest lifespans in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this idea that we're living long and healthy lives is that kind of the first indicator that the United Nations looked at when saying, good quality of life here. Second one was education. I mean, that's been transformative. I mean, again, when I studied psychology back in UCD in the late 80s, early 90s, it was 13% of the adult population had a third level qualification, 13. Today it's 51. The majority of adults in Ireland of working age now have a third level qualification, or 2. And in fact, that's rare. In a global perspective, that's rare. There's only a handful of countries for whom that's true. Canada, Singapore, South Korea, only Luxembourg is the only other country in Europe for whom that's true. So again, we have a highly educated population. Of course, that has helped us no end, both in allowing us as individuals to contribute to national well-being, to fulfill our own personal well-being, but of course to actually help bring in and attract the foreign direct investment that of course has improved that other bucket of that the UN looks at, quality of life. In other words, standard of living. Have we got a high standard of living? And of course our incomes have shot up. So we're lucky that the Central Statistics Office has been tracking average industrial wage since the 1940s. Yeah. So you can see how, in fact, going back to the 1940s, in today's money, people are earning 5 times more on the average industrial wage than our grandparents did back then. So 5 times more in today's money, stripping out inflation and everything. And unlike some other countries where the average industrial worker has seen their income stall or maybe even fall back, that's not the case in Ireland. We're continuing to see increases. And the point is that's the average industrial wage. I mean, there weren't even, of course, a whole range of jobs back in the era. There weren't software engineers and people working for multinationals. When you look at, again, the makeup of our jobs market, again, in the 1980s when I was leaving school, the CSO breaks jobs into low and medium and highly skilled jobs. High skilled was the smallest share. Nowadays, it's the biggest share. 4 in 10 people are working in high-skilled jobs, and there's more than twice as many people in jobs as there were back then. So, they're even not even in that industrial wage earners. They're well above that. So, of course, incomes have shot up in Ireland. Our quality of life has shot up in Ireland. I talk about how our housing is so much better, how the facilities in our housing are so much better. Again, for those of us who grew up in the 1970s, majority of houses didn't even have central heating.
That's right.
In the 1970s. There was still a third of houses that didn't have indoor bathrooms
Yes.
in the 1970s. So, our standard of living has undoubtedly improved, hence again, contributing to that global perspective that no matter how you cut it, we are fortunate to live here. There's been no generation that's lived a better quality of life on this island than we do today.
It seems to me that one of the most important developments in the history of our state was the decision by Donegal O'Malley in 1967 to introduce free secondary school education. That was a transformative moment, wasn't it?
It was. Now, we were late to the game. I talk about in the book how, second level education, for example, in France became free for the whole population after the First World War, in England after the Second World War. So us in the 60s, when we had all those Irish people emigrating, for example, the 50s for lack of work here, they were going to Britain and finding themselves menial jobs because they were less well educated. So we were a bit late to that. But the thing I do give Donogh O'Malley credit for is that, but also the fact that at the same time he set up regional technical colleges over the country, all over the country. So at that point in time, universities didn't teach business skills, those practical things, no, not of interest. He established the whole scientific and business qualification network in regions throughout the island, or throughout Ireland, that upskilled a whole generation of people that began us on that journey to that whole third level quality of education, building on that free second level, that really took us a step forward. That meant that we could, by the 1980s, we could have the IDA out there advertising Ireland as the young, well-educated population of Europe. And it was true. It's all the more true today. Of the kids who finished the Leaving Cert just there and have gone in, 7 in 10 of them have gone into third level colleges this year. So again, we're just going onwards and upwards in terms of education level, which is very positive as we enter our second century.
Now, we're also one of the richest countries in the world by GDP and all the rest, by per capita population. You do hear this phrase, though, leprechaun economics, that we're not as rich as we think we are because the multinationals are, they're routing a lot of their profits through us, so our GDP is inflated. And you, as I said, you hear this phrase, leprechaun economics. But if you strip that out and you look at what our gross national income, which is our purchasing power, are we still one of the richest countries in the world?
Yeah, it's obviously a very important distinction. The UN in its rankings uses GNP, not GDP. So a chunk of that multinational is cut out there. But nevertheless, they're giving us that second in the world in quality of life. The point is, of course, we do fall a bit down the rankings, particularly you mentioned purchasing power, because of course we are an expensive economy. Yeah, we're earning lots. And there's lots of money about, so prices will increase. And I do talk about that as one of our challenges going into the century ahead. But in the book, I interviewed Professor Frank Barry in Trinity College about the whole multinational impact and the positive impact. Sure. I mean, one of the things he said was, look, people in Ireland seem to have this view that those multinationals aren't paying much tax. They were not benefiting from it.
Well, we know they're paying a lot of tax because
they're paying a phenomenal amount of tax, to the point where, as you say, recently people say maybe we're over-reliant on it, but they are paying a phenomenal amount of tax. We wouldn't be able to balance our budget and to support everyone through this cost of living crisis if it wasn't for that. So undoubtedly, they've played a vital role. But I think that was within our gift. I talk about, well, why has Ireland been more successful? Comparatively speaking, why have we done better? I point to 4 factors, but one of them is openness. It's that idea that we made that shift in the late 50s, 60s, said, you know what, this whole self-reliance model isn't working out. We're going to open ourselves to the world, bring in people here, sure, foreign direct investment, but more recently, bring in the talent that we need, switch ourselves from a net emigration country now to a net immigration country in order to help our development. And that has paid us obviously huge dividends.
We talked about housing there. Obviously, this is the preeminent issue in the 100 years since the state. But you do point out in your book that, our housing stock is vastly superior to what it was 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, when you said So many people didn't even have an outdoor bathroom, right?
Yeah.
So just explain that to us. You know how we managed up until recently, really, to house everybody in satisfactorily.
Yeah, exactly. You know, housing, I think, it cuts both ways. I mean, of course, it's a current challenge. I mean, I call it out again. The final chapter in the book is about the 10 challenges for the century ahead. Of course, the fact that we have a housing crisis at the moment, you know, none of the book is denying these challenges. But to your point, it is saying that we've overcome these before, and there are plenty of positives there in terms of housing. The amount of facilities available in them, the number of houses.
Even now, toilets and indoor toilets and things we completely take for granted.
Exactly. You know, and today now the energy efficiency of housing. So again, the World Bank calls out Ireland as one of the top 5 leaders in the world in energy standards in building.
Sure.
So I mean, practically every home built today is A-rated. That's not the case elsewhere. So that's building in ourselves for the future. But I you know, to me, sure that look, you know, I talk about the factors that delivered Ireland's success. I mean, one of them has been our social cohesiveness. You know, the fact that we have a strong sense of community. There isn't really a them and us. We're a small country, really. You know, a lot of them might have left in the 1920s. It was a republic for the people of the state. But I think that there is, you know, and therefore we have high levels of interpersonal trust in the country. We have a strong sense of community. But I do think this is one of the challenges with the housing crisis. You know, it is beginning to fracture that a bit. You know, it's fine for maybe us here, you know, a little older to be talking about having our mortgages and our houses. There's a generation, for whom they feel they can't get on that ladder at all. And that begins to undermine our success into the next century if we don't address that.
Your book is quite a startling rebuttal to the failed state narrative. Irish people find it hard to believe anything good about the country a lot of the time. Why is that?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I hope the book is doing that, because I think, again, you look at the facts, you say, failed state, there's no evidence for that. It's not supported by the evidence. I have a chapter in the book about bringing that psychology background into it. You know, why do people not feel this then? Why is that not what we're reading in the headlines in the newspapers or on RT every day of the week? And the answer is universal in the human sense, because, you know, you ask people, again, there are surveys globally asking people in most countries, do they think the world is getting better or worse? Unquestionably, most people in practically every country thinks the world is going downhill.
I blame the media.
Well,
sorry, go on,
I know, there's a role, but I don't blame the media in the sense that the media are giving us what we pay attention to.
Yes.
There are 5 psychological biases that prevent us seeing positive progress that I talk about in the book. I mean, the negativity bias. So human beings are attracted to the negative. Again, there's a wonderful study I talk about done in McGill University in Toronto. They sat people down at a computer and said, right, we're going to test you now with this eye tracker here on about what you're looking at on this web page. So you just browse around the website there and we'll calibrate the camera, you know. But there wasn't any camera. It was really about what people were looking at on a website that had perfectly balanced good news and bad news, extremely good, extremely bad, seeing what people paid attention to. And you guessed it, they paid attention to the negative news stories. And the more interested people were in politics and current affairs, the more they viewed the negative stories. So, that, I mean, look, that's what we're tuned to pick up on as human beings. So that's what the media serves us, because that's what wins the eyeballs. That's what the algorithms serve us. The problem is that now, I suppose, that negative news is at our fingertips all the time. You know, it's in the phone, it's 24 news cycle. You can, if you want, indulge yourself. That misleads you. That misleads you. Oh my God, there's a lot more negative news around than there was 20 years ago. Well, it's a lot more accessible, yes, but there's not more of it, actually.
Yeah.
But the algorithm is serving us more of it. So that does mislead us into thinking that things are getting worse. So that's not unique to Ireland by any means. So I think it's fair to say the news cycles globally and the social media news cycles globally are misleading. They're giving us a bit more of a negative. But unfortunately, that's what we reward them with, eyeballs and time with, and likes and shares.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a universal phenomenon. But it seems to me that other countries, like, for instance, I mean, they're longer established than us, like France, United States, Great Britain, can unabashedly celebrate their states while still acknowledging that not everything's perfect. And yet, it seems to be an Irish phenomenon that we tend to believe the worst about ourselves.
I think there is some truth to that. I mean, you know, why aren't we having street parties on December 6th?
Well, why aren't we, do you think?
Yeah, you know, why aren't we? I do think, ironically, part of our success is that our politicians are very close to our people, I argue. So I talk about our stability as a nation. You know, we have had centrist politics for 100 years.
Sure.
That has served us well. I make the case that has served us well. We haven't had the extremes of, you know, Republicans or Democrats or Labour or Conservatives. We haven't had the far right or the left. We haven't had that. That has served us in good stead. But at the same time, our proportional representation system means people are very close to the people whom they're serving. I mean, they are teachers, they are you know, nurses, and they're accountants locally. I think that makes it difficult for people to shout success. They don't want to be seen to be saying, look at what we've done. I'm one of you. I rely on you for my vote. So I don't want to stand up there and say, wait a minute, look what I've achieved. And that's a strength on one side, but I think it holds us back from celebrating what does need to be celebrated, and hence the book.
Well, I do think that there's an air of ambivalence as well about the state, because obviously, you know, I mean, you make the distinction between the nation, which is 32 counties, and the 26, and there is still a feeling that we're a temporary little arrangement that really will never be a proper country until we're a 32 county state. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. When I've presented and talked about the book, a lot of people have said, but what about Northern Ireland? And, you know, it took me 3 years to compile this bit, so I didn't have time to do a Northern Ireland one. It'd be the second volume. But the academics now are beginning to look at this in the conversation about a united Ireland and a shared Ireland. The Royal Irish Academy, for example, starting a stream of research to say, well, what is in fact the difference between North and South on lots of these quality of life measures? And there is a gap. There is a gap. The Republic has done well. It is healthier people than Northern
I think it's about a year and a half more people live in the South than the North, which is a startling statistic.
You know, the higher education levels, less poverty, definitively less poverty in the Republic. So you know, partition maybe for the first 50 years served the people of Northern Ireland better. In the last 50 years, the converse is true, generally speaking. But you know, I suppose this is a political view as to whether if we brought everyone together, whether that would reduce the average, and whether we'd have to take a while to invest to bring the people of Northern Ireland up to the living standards of that we are enjoying in the Republic currently.
I suppose the final question is, we're in 2022. What do you think Ireland's going to look, or what would you like Ireland to look like in 21-22, in another 100 years?
I think, you know, a lot of
hopefully we won't be washed into the sea with
this will be some archive, Ronan. People will dig it out and they'll prove us wrong or not. But I think a lot of our development in the first century there, and of course most of it is in the last 50 years really, since we joined the EU and we opened up and everything. But I think we developed so much without paying attention to the whole environmental side, the natural capital, the biodiversity. We didn't pay any attention to that. I talk about this in the book. It is a challenge now because, you know, we are one of the top 3 polluters in that sense, you know, even in Europe in terms of CO2 emissions. If you look at our biodiversity, even the protected lands that we have, majority of them are in decline or not in a stable state. So, you know, we have to fix that. But we have huge potential natural resources. You know, we've made fantastic progress. Again, I talk about it in renewable energy and electrifying Ireland. So could we be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy and exporting huge amounts of it globally by in 100 years' time? Absolutely, absolutely. Why not?
Good. Well, Mark's book, in fact, An Optimist's Guide to Ireland at 100, is available in all good bookstores, and I thoroughly recommend it. Mark Henry, thank you very much.
Thanks for the time, Ronan.